Daniel Walker was a man who had built his business from the ground up. He had worked tirelessly for years, pouring all his energy into making his company successful. It had grown fast, faster than he expected, and with that growth came overwhelming responsibilities. His days were consumed by endless meetings, emails that never seemed to stop, and decisions that carried the weight of the company's future. His work left no space for anything else. No social life, no hobbies, no relationships. Even simple things like remembering to eat on time or take a break had become difficult. He was always running, always chasing the next goal, but lately he had begun to feel exhausted. One evening, as he sat alone in his office, looking at the long list of unfinished tasks, he sighed deeply. He had tried handling everything himself, but it was becoming impossible. He needed help. The thought of hiring an assistant had crossed his mind before, but he had always pushed it away. He wasn't used to relying on others. He liked control, and trusting someone else with important work felt risky. But now, he had no choice. He placed an advertisement online, stating clearly what he was looking for: someone efficient, organized, and capable of handling pressure. Within hours, applications flooded his inbox. He spent the next day going through them, but none of the candidates seemed right. Some lacked experience, others seemed unsure of themselves, and a few had good resumes but didn't seem like the kind of person who could match his pace. Just as he was about to close his laptop in frustration, one name caught his eye: Sophia Carter. Her resume was impressive, but it wasn't just her qualifications that stood out. It was the way she described herself. "I don't just manage schedules, I take care of problems before they exist." Something about that sentence intrigued him. He decided to call her for an interview. The next morning, she walked into his office, and for the first time in a long time, Daniel was caught off guard. She was nothing like what he had expected. Tall and confident, with long, dark hair that flowed over her shoulders, she carried herself with grace but also with power. Her bright blue eyes locked onto his as she walked toward him, as if she already knew him, as if she had already studied everything about him before stepping into the room. "Mr. Walker," she said smoothly, offering a handshake. He shook her hand, noting how firm her grip was. "Please, take a seat," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. She sat down without hesitation, her expression calm and unreadable. There was no nervousness, no uncertainty, only quiet confidence. Daniel had interviewed many people before, but something about her presence made him feel like she was the one in control of the room, not him. He cleared his throat and looked at her resume. "You have an impressive background. You've worked with some top executives. Why are you interested in this position?" She tilted her head slightly, as if considering how much she should reveal. "Because I like a challenge," she said finally. "I've read about your company. It's growing fast, and that means chaos." "I'm good at handling chaos." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You sound very sure of yourself." She smiled slightly. "Because I know what I can do. You don't just need an assistant, Mr. Walker. You need someone who will make sure nothing falls apart. Someone who will see problems before they reach you. Someone who will manage your life so you can focus on what matters." Her words hit him harder than he expected. She wasn't wrong. He did need someone like that. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "And you think you can do that?" "I don't think," she said. "I know." For a long moment, there was silence between them. He had never met someone so direct, so self-assured. Most candidates tried to impress him by listing their skills, but she wasn't just listing skills, she was promising results. Finally, he nodded. "You're hired." She gave him a small, knowing smile. "Good decision." As she stood up and walked out of the office, Daniel exhaled, realizing he had been holding his breath. He didn't know why, but something about this woman told him that things were about to change. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if he was in control anymore. Sophia Carter started working the very next day, and from the moment she stepped into Daniel's office, things began to change. She didn't waste time asking unnecessary questions or waiting for instructions. She simply took control. Daniel had expected to spend a few days explaining things to her, guiding her through his routine, and helping her adjust to the way he worked. But Sophia didn't need any of that. It was as if she had already figured out everything before she even started. By the afternoon of her first day, Daniel realized that she had already rearranged his entire schedule. Meetings that used to drag on for hours were now cut down to half the time. Emails that would have taken him days to respond to were already answered. Even his office, which had always been cluttered with papers and unfinished projects, was suddenly neat and organized. At first, he felt uneasy. He wasn't used to someone stepping in and changing things without asking. He had built this company from scratch, and he liked doing things his way. But as the hours passed, he started to notice something. He was actually getting work done faster. For the first time in years, he wasn't drowning in tasks. By the end of the first week, Daniel knew that hiring Sophia had been one of the best decisions he had ever made. But there was something else, something strange, that he couldn't ignore. It wasn't just that she was good at her job, it was the way she seemed to know things before he even said them. One morning, he walked into his office, exhausted from a long night of working late. He hadn't told anyone that he had barely slept, but the moment he sat down at his desk, Sophia appeared with a cup of coffee. "Strong, no sugar," she said, placing it in front of him. He blinked, surprised. "How did you know that's how I take my coffee?" She simply smiled. "I pay attention." It wasn't just the coffee. She always seemed to be one step ahead of him. She reminded him of things he had forgotten without needing to check notes. She scheduled breaks for him before he even realized he needed them. She handled small crises before they even reached his desk. One afternoon, as he was getting ready to leave for an important client meeting, she stopped him at the door. "You need to change your tie," she said. He frowned. "What's wrong with my tie?" "Your client prefers softer colors. Blue makes you look too aggressive. Wear the gray one instead." Daniel hesitated for a moment before doing as she suggested. Later that day, during the meeting, he noticed the client relaxing more than usual. They closed the deal without any tension. It was a small detail, but it mattered. That night, as he sat alone in his office, he couldn't stop thinking about her. She wasn't just an assistant, she was something more. It felt like she had studied him, memorized every little thing about him, and was now using that knowledge to make his life easier. The strangest part was that he didn't mind. Normally, he would hate the idea of someone having that much control over his routine. He liked being in charge, making his own decisions, but with Sophia, it was different. It didn't feel like she was taking control away from him. It felt like she was making everything work better, smoother, more efficiently. One evening, as they were wrapping up for the day, he finally asked her the question that had been bothering him. "Sophia, how do you always know exactly what I need before I even say it?" She looked at him, her blue eyes calm and unreadable. "I told you, Mr. Walker. I pay attention." There was something in the way she said it, something almost unsettling. Not in a bad way, but in a way that made him wonder just how much she knew about him. It was as if she could read his thoughts, predict his actions before he even made them. For the first time in a long time, Daniel felt something unfamiliar. He wasn't in control anymore, and what was even more surprising was that he didn't seem to mind. One night, Daniel stayed late at the office, buried in paperwork and unfinished tasks. The city outside was quiet, the usual rush of traffic long gone, leaving only the distant hum of streetlights and the occasional car passing by. He had been at his desk for hours, barely noticing the time, his mind completely consumed by work. His body ached from sitting too long, his head throbbed from lack of sleep, but he kept going. When he finally looked up, he realized it was past midnight. He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. It had been a long day, and he needed to get some rest. As he gathered his things, he was startled to see someone standing by the door. Sophia. She was leaning against the frame, arms crossed, watching him with that same calm, knowing expression she always had. He blinked in surprise. "What are you still doing here?" he asked, his voice rough from exhaustion. "I should be asking you that," she replied smoothly. "You need to go home." Daniel let out a small, tired chuckle. "I will. Just finishing up a few things." "No," she said firmly, "you need rest. You've been working non-stop for weeks, and it's starting to show." He frowned slightly. "I can handle it." She stepped closer, placing her hands on his desk as she leaned in just slightly. "You say that, but I can see it. You're exhausted. You're distracted. And if you keep pushing yourself like this, you're going to crash." He looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment, he saw something in her eyes, concern, maybe even care. It wasn't just about work for her. She wasn't saying this because it was her job. She was saying it because she meant it. Before he could argue, she picked up his phone from the desk, and with a few quick taps, made a reservation. "You're taking a break," she announced. 3 days at a beach resort. No work, no emails, no phone calls. Daniel stared at her in disbelief. "You can't just book a vacation for me." "I already did," she said with a small smirk. "Your flight leaves in the morning." He was about to protest, but then she lifted a bag from the floor and placed it on his desk. "And before you ask, I already packed for you." Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it. He was speechless. He wasn't used to people making decisions for him, let alone taking complete control of his life like this. But the strangest part was that he didn't feel angry. If anyone else had done this, he would have fired them on the spot, but with Sophia, it was different. "Why are you doing this?" he asked after a moment. She tilted her head slightly. "Because you need it. And because I won't let you destroy yourself over work." There was something about the way she said it, something so matter-of-fact that it sent a strange feeling through his chest. No one had ever spoken to him like that before. No one had ever taken charge of him, not in this way. He exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. "And what if I say no?" She smiled, that same confident, almost teasing smile. "Then I'll book another flight and send you anyway." For a long moment they simply stared at each other, the tension between them heavy and unspoken. Then, to his own surprise, Daniel let out a small laugh. "Fine," he said finally, "I'll go." Sophia nodded, satisfied. "Good." As she turned to leave, he watched her, something shifting inside him. He had hired her to manage his work, to handle schedules and meetings. But somehow, she had done more than that. She had stepped into his life completely, taken control in ways he had never expected. And the strangest part, he wasn't sure he wanted her to stop. Daniel had spent 3 days at the beach resort, following Sophia's orders to take a break. At first he had felt restless, constantly checking his phone, his fingers itching to respond to emails. But eventually something strange happened. He relaxed. The sound of the waves, the warmth of the sun, the feeling of doing absolutely nothing, it felt foreign, but also necessary. He hadn't realized how much he needed this escape until he finally let himself breathe. But no matter how beautiful the ocean was, his mind kept drifting back to one thing, or rather one person. Sophia. She had taken control of his life in a way no one ever had before, and he hadn't even resisted. That should have scared him, should have made him feel like he was losing control, but instead it intrigued him. He missed the way she spoke to him without hesitation, the way she knew what he needed before he even said it. He missed her presence, the way she filled his office, his world, without even trying. When he returned to work, he expected things to go back to normal. But the moment he walked into his office and saw her standing there, waiting for him, something inside him shifted. "Welcome back," she said with her usual calm tone, handing him a cup of coffee, just the way he liked it. He took it, but instead of drinking, he studied her. "Did you miss me?" Sophia didn't flinch. "I missed the order in the office," she said smoothly, a hint of amusement in her eyes. "Things fall apart when you're not here." He smirked. "That's not an answer." She tilted her head slightly, but didn't respond. That was Sophia. Always in control, always composed, but Daniel was starting to wonder what was beneath that surface. Over the next few days, he found himself watching her more closely. He noticed the way she brushed a strand of hair behind her ear when she was deep in thought. The way her lips curled into a small smirk when she predicted something before it happened. The way she never hesitated, never second-guessed herself. She fascinated him. One evening, as they worked late in the office, the air between them felt heavier than usual. Sophia was reviewing a report while Daniel leaned back in his chair, his gaze locked on her. "You know," he said, "you're not just my assistant." She didn't look up. "I know." That made him smile. "You control my schedule, my work, my life. You even tell me when to sleep and when to take a vacation." "Someone has to," she replied, still focused on the report. Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "So what happens if I start wanting you to control more than just my work?" That made her pause. Slowly she looked up, meeting his gaze. "Daniel," she started, her voice quieter than before. He wasn't sure what had made him say it out loud. Maybe it was the way she had taken over his world so effortlessly. Maybe it was the way he couldn't stop thinking about her. Or maybe it was the fact that for the first time in years he wanted something that had nothing to do with business. I missed you, he admitted, his voice low, honest. Sophia inhaled slightly as if steadying herself. You shouldn't say things like that. Why not? Because if you start looking at me like that, things will change, she said, her voice softer now, almost hesitant. Daniel held her gaze, feeling the tension growing between them, thick and undeniable. Maybe I want things to change. For the first time since he had met her, Sophia looked uncertain, and that made Daniel want her even more. The moment Daniel said those words, something between them shifted. It was as if a silent barrier, carefully built over the past weeks, had started to crack. Sophia had always been composed, always in control, but now for the first time he saw hesitation in her eyes. It was brief, just a flicker, but it was there. She turned her gaze back to the report in her hands, as if pretending she hadn't heard him. We should finish this, she said, her voice quieter than before. Daniel wasn't going to let her avoid it. He stood up, walking around the desk until he was close to her. Closer than he had ever allowed himself to be. Sophia, he said, his tone softer now, more personal. Look at me. For a few seconds, she didn't move. Then slowly she lifted her eyes to meet his. There it was again, that hesitation, but there was something else too, something she was trying to hide. You're my boss, she said finally, as if reminding both of them. He nodded. I know. This isn't a good idea. Why? Because it will complicate everything. Daniel tilted his head slightly, studying her. You've been running my life, Sophia, telling me what to do, what to wear, when to sleep. You even decided when I should take a vacation, and you were right about all of it. So tell me, what does your instinct say about this? Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. For once, she didn't have an answer. He took another step closer, closing the last bit of space between them. His hand moved, almost on its own, reaching out to tuck a strand of her dark hair behind her ear. It was such a small thing, but it felt like crossing a line neither of them could return from. She inhaled sharply at his touch. Daniel. He heard the warning in her voice, but he also heard the way it wavered. She wasn't unaffected. Tell me you don't feel it, he said. Tell me you don't think about me the way I think about you, and I'll walk away. She closed her eyes for a second, as if gathering herself. When she opened them again, they were filled with something he hadn't seen before. Conflict, need, fear. Do you have any idea what you're doing? She whispered. He gave a small, almost amused smile. For once I don't, and I don't care. Sophia exhaled, shaking her head slightly. This is reckless. Maybe. It's a mistake. Maybe not. She studied him for a long moment, her fingers tightening around the papers in her hands. Then, suddenly, she placed them down on the desk and let out a slow breath. Just once, she said quietly. If we do this, just once. Daniel felt something stir deep inside him, something dangerous and undeniable. He knew this wasn't going to be just once. He knew that the moment he touched her, there would be no going back. But he didn't say that. Instead, he reached for her, his fingers brushing against her waist as he pulled her in. Sophia didn't resist. If anything, she leaned into him, her body fitting against his as if she had belonged there all along. And then finally, he kissed her. It wasn't careful, it wasn't hesitant, it was deep, intense, filled with everything they had both been holding back. Her hands moved up, gripping the front of his shirt, pulling him closer. Daniel's grip tightened around her waist, his heart pounding as the last barrier between them shattered. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't just once. And they both knew it. The moment Daniel kissed Sophia, everything changed. There was no more pretense, no more control, just raw, unspoken emotions finally breaking free. He could feel the tension melting between them, the push and pull that had existed from the beginning turning into something undeniable. She wasn't just his assistant anymore, she was something more. But as soon as the moment ended, reality crashed down on them. Sophia pulled away first, her breath unsteady, her eyes filled with something between regret and longing. This was a mistake, she whispered, stepping back. Daniel's chest tightened. Don't say that. She shook her head, running a hand through her hair as she tried to steady herself. You're my boss, Daniel. This isn't supposed to happen. His jaw clenched. But it did. And now what? She asked, looking at him with those piercing blue eyes. Do we pretend it didn't happen? Do we act like everything is the same? He didn't have an answer, and that frustrated him. He wasn't used to being caught off guard, but Sophia had always been different. She made him feel things he wasn't supposed to feel. She made him lose control. Sophia exhaled, gathering her things quickly. "This can't happen again," she said, her voice firm, though he could hear the hesitation beneath it. Daniel watched her, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He wanted to argue, to tell her that she was wrong, that whatever was between them was real. But he could see it in her eyes. She was already putting up walls, shutting him out before he could even try. "Sophia," he said softly, taking a step toward her. She took a step back. "I need to go." And just like that, she walked out, leaving him standing there, alone, with nothing but the memory of her lips on his. The next day, things were different. Sophia was back to being professional, back to keeping her distance. It was as if nothing had happened. She still managed his schedule, still anticipated his needs, still kept everything running smoothly. There was a coldness to her now, a barrier he hadn't felt before. Daniel hated it. He hated the way she avoided his gaze, the way she kept conversations short and strictly professional. He hated the way she acted like the night before had been nothing more than a mistake. Because for him it wasn't. For the first time in a long time, he had felt something real. And he wasn't going to let it slip away. That evening, as they were wrapping up for the day, he made his decision. He waited until everyone else had left the office before speaking. "Sophia, stay?" She hesitated for just a second before nodding. "Do you need something, Mr. Walker?" His jaw tightened at the way she addressed him. "Drop the formalities. You don't call me that." She let out a small breath. "Daniel, this isn't a good idea." He leaned against his desk, arms crossed. "You keep saying that, but do you believe it?" She didn't answer. He took a step closer. "I know what you're doing, Sophia. You're trying to act like nothing happened because you think it's the right thing to do. But we both know the truth. That kiss wasn't a mistake." She swallowed, her fingers gripping the folder in her hands a little too tightly. "It doesn't matter," she said quietly. "You're my boss. We have rules for a reason." "Screw the rules," Daniel said, his voice low. "I don't care about them." She let out a humorless laugh. "You might not, but I do. I've worked too hard to get here, to build my career. I won't throw it away because of this." Daniel's expression softened. "Sophia, I would never let that happen. I would never do anything to hurt your career." She looked at him, then really looked at him, and for the first time she seemed uncertain. The walls she had built so quickly were cracking, just a little. But then she sighed, shaking her head. "This will only end badly, Daniel. We both know that." Before he could say anything else, she turned and walked out. Again. And this time he wasn't sure if she would come back. Daniel sat in his office, staring at the door where Sophia had just walked out. Again, he clenched his jaw, feeling something unfamiliar, something that felt dangerously close to loss. He had always been in control, always made decisions without hesitation. But this was different. Days passed, and Sophia kept her distance. She was still professional, still efficient, but she wasn't the same. She'd avoided unnecessary conversation, never met his gaze for too long, and left the office the moment her work was done. It drove him insane. One evening, Daniel found himself in his penthouse, a glass of whiskey in his hand, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought about the first time he met her, the way she had walked into his office with quiet confidence, not intimidated by him like most people were. He thought about the way she had slowly taken over his life, not just by organizing his schedule, but by understanding him in ways no one else ever had. He couldn't just let her go. Without thinking, he grabbed his keys and left. Sophia was in her apartment, curled up on the couch, trying to focus on a book. But she had read the same sentence 5 times and still hadn't absorbed a single word. She hated this. She hated how much space Daniel had taken up in her mind. She hated how that kiss had shaken her. And most of all, she hated that she wanted it to happen again. A knock at her door startled her. She wasn't expecting anyone. For a second, she thought about ignoring it, but then she heard his voice. "Sophia, open the door." Her breath caught. She hesitated, but she knew he wouldn't leave until she let him in. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door. Daniel stood there, looking like he hadn't slept. His tie was loosened, his hair slightly messy, but his eyes, those sharp, dark eyes, were locked on her with an intensity that made her chest tighten. "What are you doing here?" she asked, gripping the doorframe to keep herself steady. He exhaled sharply. "I can't do this anymore." Sophia's heart pounded. "Do what?" "Pretend like nothing happened. Pretend like I don't." He stopped, running a hand through his hair before looking at her again. "Like I don't want you." Her throat went dry. "Daniel." "No." He cut her off, stepping closer. "Let me talk." His voice was low, firm, but there was something almost vulnerable underneath it. "You think this will ruin everything. That being with me will somehow destroy your career of your life. But Sophia, you already run my life. You have from the moment you walked into my office." She looked away, trying to steady her breathing. "That's different." "How?" "Because if this goes wrong, I lose everything," she whispered. "You'll be fine, Daniel. You'll move on. But me? I'll be the woman who got too close to the boss and ruined her career." Daniel's expression hardened. "You really think I would ever let that happen?" She swallowed. "You can't promise that." "Yes, I can." His voice softened. "Sophia, I don't want just a moment with you. I don't want just one kiss or one night. I want more. And if that means breaking some rules, then so be it." She stared at him, her heart slamming against her ribs. "You don't even know what you're asking for." He took another step, closing the distance between them. His hand reached up, cupping her cheek gently. "Yes, I do." Sophia inhaled sharply at his touch. She wanted to pull away, to tell him this was a mistake, but she couldn't, because the truth was she didn't want to fight it anymore. So this time she was the one who kissed him. And just like before, it wasn't careful. It wasn't hesitant. It was everything they had been holding back. Daniel wrapped his arms around her, pulling her flesh against him, deepening the kiss as if he was afraid she might pull away. But she didn't, because there was no turning back now.